Last week we looked at the rise of Constantine the Great, or Saint Constantine as he is known in the East. It was during his reign and under his watchful eye that the most important event since Pentecost took place in the church, an event which was the culmination of over 300 years of convergence and which would, to this day, form the universal basic Christianity across the globe. And this event took place in AD 325, and it is known as the First Council of Nicaea. Three things were discussed at this council, and despite high hopes, only one of them was truly settled. What was settled rather decisively was the question of whether Christians should reckon Easter by the Jewish lunar calendar or by a calendar of their own computations, and the latter was chosen quite decisively. For more on that kind of discussion, look back to episode 14 of this series and Melito and Christian festivals. But what are the other two issues that were discussed and not resolved? Well, they're somewhat entwined together by the people involved. So let's dive in. It's a wild ride of schism and strife and even Santa Claus punching someone in the face. Now, in previous weeks, I've mentioned, but not really discussed, something called the Donatist controversy, which raged across North Africa from AD 311 or so. And we will look at this in more detail when we study the mighty St. Augustine. But it is relevant to mention now at the start for two reasons. Firstly, the core issues in the Donatist controversy was one which we've encountered numerous times now in Tertullian, in Cyprian, in Hippolytus, in Irenaeus. And the issue was, what do you do with Christians who during times of great persecution lapse in their faith, who renege on their promises to Christ? What do you do with ministers who reneged on their promises, or people who were ordained ministers by people who had lapsed in their faith? What about their sacraments? Are they valid in any kind of way? And as I said, this is not a new issue, but it is one which would flare up again in North Africa around Carthage with the Donatists, where there was this strong brand of hot-headed Christianity dating back to Tertullian and the Montanists. Now, Constantine, taking control of the entire western half of the empire and adopting Christianity, waded into this Donatist controversy as a council which he presides over. And he had the Donatists excommunicated and exiled from the Roman Empire, cast out of the church. The issue would rage on and on for some time though, but as far as Constantine was concerned, he had settled which lot were the truth and which ones were not, which were for unity and which were the true church. And that was enough for him. Why is this relevant? Both what is the topic of the controversy and Constantine's involvement? Well, similar issues were to break out in Alexandria and Egypt during the reign of Diocletian and his great persecution, as well as what followed. So this is the guy who set up the time of the four emperors. And this is known as the Melitian Schism, after the man who started it, one Bishop Melitius of Lycopolis. Lycopolis was a city pretty much bang in the centre of Egypt, along the Nile. Now, by convention, the Bishop of Alexandria, the Pope of Alexandria as he was known, had nominal authority over all of Egypt. All the bishops there answered to him. And the Pope at the time was a Pope called Peter. And under the reign of Emperor Diocletian, Pope Peter of Alexandria was imprisoned. And whilst imprisoned, it seems that this Bishop Melitius took it upon himself to act as the bishop over all of Egypt, to go around ordaining ministers and travelling the provinces and gaining support and writing letters encouraging Christians, taking over the other episcopal duties. Why he did this or thought he could do this, we don't know. but it was certainly out of line. In Alexandria, that city where the Pope was based, one of the men who assisted him in gaining control and influence was a man named Arius. In time, Melitius would actually ordain Arius as a presbyter shortly before Melitius himself was imprisoned. With both Peter and Melitius in prison, there was something of a letter-writing contest between the two. In one letter, Peter sided with Cyprian, who was writing 50 years prior, and he wrote on this and he said, look, Christians who have lapsed in their faith, who have reneged on their faith due to persecution, if they repent, they are welcome back into the church. And the sacraments of ministers who lapsed in the faith, those two are valid sacraments if they repent. Well, this really didn't sit well with the hot-headed Melitius, and so he founded in prison, in this quarry, this gulag which he was in, something he called the Church of the Martyrs, the church which would do true justice to those who were martyred for the faith. After a mass release of people from prison in AD 311, many of the more extreme Christians flooded the churches and they sided with Melitius, and his churches, the churches of the martyrs, swelled. By AD 325 in the Council of Nicaea, the Melitian churches boasted 28 bishops in contest with Orthodox bishops, and also numerous presbyters and deacons. Now, despite the strength of this Church of the Martyrs, the Orthodox Church, based around Peter, the Pope of Alexandria, was still clearly stronger and larger. And because of this, after Melitius went to prison, the man who had supported him in Alexandria, the man who had ordained him as presbyter, Arius, cozied up to Peter again, allowing himself to be reordained properly as deacon. And he was ordained as presbyter properly under the next Pope of Alexandria. You see, he fell out with Peter once again in the meantime. And it seems that Arius himself was a hot-headed man. He was certainly intelligent and a powerful speaker with the support of many of the poorer masses. Now, Arius was not actually an Alexandrian, but a Libyan who studied in Antioch. Now, if you remember, Antioch was the other major centre of Christianity in the East, and in many ways it was in direct competition with Alexandria for power and fame and prestige. These two cities' theological perspectives differed, with Antioch being the more literal and biblicist, and Alexandria the more allegorical and philosophical, and they would endlessly fight over the next few centuries. Epiphanius of Salamis would describe Arius in this way: tall and lean, of distinguished appearance and polished address, women doted on him, charmed by his beautiful manners, touched by his appearance of asceticism. Men were impressed by his aura of intellectual superiority. So what we have here is a convincing and charismatic minister, well beloved of the people, with a mighty intellect from the school of Antioch, but ministering in Alexandria. A man who supported the wrong side of history in Melitius, but then showed himself duplicitous in going back to the Orthodox Peter, yet still managed to fall foul of him due to arguments. In AD 312, Alexander of Alexandria, a great tongue twister, Alexander of Alexandria, is raised to Pope of Alexandria. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. In AD 318, the streets of Alexandria were overtaken by rioting. A large crowd took to the streets chanting, "There was a time when Christ was not. There was a time when Christ was not. And another crowd opposed them, insisting that Christ was co-eternal with the Father and not a creation. And so the battle lines were drawn, which would literally tear the Roman Empire apart over the coming few centuries. On the one hand, the Arians chanting, "There was a time when Christ was not." And on the other, the supporters of Alexander, declaring Christ co-eternal with the Father. Now, Arius didn't want to start a fight, we don't think. He rejected the teaching of Sabellius, known as modalism, the idea that God is one thing who appears in three different ways, like a single actor wearing three different masks of Father, Son and Spirit at different times. He rejected the teaching of Paul of Samosata, known as adoptionism, that the human Christ was adopted by God to become the Son of God, but he wasn't actually God. Arius reasoned that given that God cannot change, cannot grow, cannot regress, cannot be divided up, that he is impassible, as we call it, then Arius reasoned that the Son cannot be co-eternal with the Father, but must be the first and supreme creation of the Father, higher than all other creatures, but still ultimately a creature who in every way is subordinate to the Father. He argued that the Son was begotten of the Father timelessly, before time itself, before Genesis 1:1, but was nonetheless a creature of the eternal Father. He would grant that the Son was of like substance, of like nature, of like essence with the Father. Homoi ousias in the Greek, homoi ousias, but not the same substance, not the same essence, not the same nature, homo ousias. Alexander was not impressed. If the Father cannot change, then he must have always been the Father. And to be a father, you must have a child, you must have the Son. Thus the Father and the Son must always have existed together. If the Son is eternal, because he is the Son of the Father, then he must be of equal status and substance and nature and essence as the Father, who alone is eternal. The Son must therefore be of the same substance, the same ousia of the Father, but a different person. The word we use for person is hypostasis. So one ousia, different hypostases. The only difference, Alexander said, between the two is that the Son is begotten of the Father and the Father is unbegotten. It's their relationship to each other which distinguishes them, not their divine nature. They're both completely God in every way. It's the relationship between these two persons of the Trinity by which we can distinguish them. Well, Alexander, despite the riots, calls a council to resolve this, and the bishops at this council sided with Alexander against Arius. Arius and 5 other presbyters and 6 deacons are condemned for heresy and thrown out of the church. The problem is that Arius had international support from his time studying in Antioch, which was always up for a fight with Alexandria. 2 prominent bishops, both named Eusebius, supported Arius. Eusebius of Caesarea, the famous church historian we've mentioned many times in our series, and most importantly, Eusebius of Nicaea, which was the temporary capital of Constantine's new united Roman Empire. And this Eusebius of Nicaea was the one who held the emperor's ear. Synods in Bithynia and in Palestine, sided with Arius and called on Alexander to reinstate him. Schism erupted. An Arian who supported Arius was elected as an anti-pope in Alexandria, in direct opposition to Alexander. Combined with the issues of a breakaway Melitian church, the whole church became a laughingstock, which was joked about in pagan theatres. Constantine was not amused. For him, there was one God, and so there should be one church. His God was a God who united the entire Roman Empire through his servant Constantine, and thus it was also God's will for Constantine to unite the whole church. And so Constantine calls a church council to decide on these matters, and it would meet in Nicaea in AD 325. It was a lavish affair, opulent feasts and accommodation. Every bishop in known Christendom was invited to bring 2 presbyters and a number of deacons and acolytes and servants as they wanted. About 318 bishops attended. With their entourages, it would have numbered in the thousands. All of this was made possible by Constantine, who paid for everything and guaranteed their safety. Many bishops who attended this council still bore physical marks of their torture under Diocletian and others. So this turn of events must have been most discombobulating for them. Now, this council would later be known as the First Ecumenical Council because it involved the worldwide church. That word ecumenical comes from the Greek word for the whole world. Though most of the bishops were Greek and from the Eastern Empire, the council was presided over by a Spanish bishop from Cordoba. It was attended by the bishops in North Africa. It was attended by bishops from Italy and France and Serbia, and even the Bishop of York attended from Britain. Rome's bishop did not come, the Pope of Rome did not come, but he did send 2 presbyters to be there to represent him. Bishops also came from outside the empire. You had bishops from Armenia, from Arabia, from Mesopotamia, and even Persia, effectively stretching the coverage all the way from Spain to modern-day Afghanistan. This was truly an ecumenical council like no other. And things in the debating chamber were heated. At one point, Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra, now known to us as Santa Claus or Saint Nick, became so enraged by the claim that Jesus was not eternal and equal to the Father that he slapped, perhaps even punched Arius in the face. Constantine himself took an active role. He was present before every discussion, and he added his thoughts and thinking as he saw fit. What is surprising when you consider this whole council and Constantine, as we discussed last week, is that he could have found some wording that would satisfy everyone. If all he wanted was unity in the church, there was some kind of compromise that could have been made. The Arians were happy with the Nicene Creed as it was proposed in the most part, as they could read it in a way that suited them. When the council produced a wording, "And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father, light of light, very God of very God, begotten not made," the Arians were happy. Apparently they were snickering and winking at each other, saying, "This is fine, we can make this work." Then Constantine did something strange, which was the opposite of promoting unity. Perhaps he was prompted by his advisor, the Spanish Bishop of Cordoba, but we don't know. He said that another line should be added to the creed, one that said that Jesus Christ was of one substance with the Father, or one essence with the Father, of the same nature as the Father. That word, homoousias. Homoousias. Constantine was siding with Alexander against Arius. At the end of the creed would also be added a note saying that anyone who supported Arius' teaching was anathema to the church, and Arius was to be denounced as a minister along with any who supported him. This was strong stuff, very strong. All but 2 of the bishops attending signed the minutes of the council. The 2 who didn't, they accepted the creed, but they felt that Arius should be restored if he recanted. With regard to the Melitian crisis, the council ruled that Melitius could remain bishop, although no longer attached to one settlement, and he could no longer ordain other people on his own. And the bishops that he had appointed could no longer be in contest with the Orthodox bishops. They would have to step aside and go back to being presbyters. Anyone he or his bishops had ordained as presbyter was recognised as being validly ordained. This peace didn't last though, and controversy would rage on for decades after the death of Melitius. You see, after the death of Melitius, his church sided with the Arians, something that would make Melitius turn in his grave, as he was very much against Arius. In fact, perhaps the only reason why Alexander escalated it so far is because of pressure from the Melitians. And thus there was havoc in the church when Athanasius of Alexander was elected as the new pope there. And we'll look at that in another week. The Melitians, though, would over time slowly lose influence and eventually remain as only small, scattered monastic sects until the Arab invasions of the 8th century. As just hinted, though, the Arian crisis didn't go away. The Melitians turned and started supporting him and opposing Athanasius, the new bishop in Alexandria. Arius himself would be restored to the church in AD 327 after Alexander died, but the new pope, Athanasius, would not allow Arius to go back to the church there. In AD 336, Constantine insisted that Arius be accepted back into the church and ordered the Bishop of Constantinople to do so. The bishop in Constantinople didn't want to let a heretic back into the church, despite this heretic's pleas that he had changed his mind. But he also didn't want to go against his emperor. And so the bishop prayed that God would smite Arius and take this problem out of his hands. The day before Arius was due to be reintroduced as a presbyter into the church and restored once more, he suddenly had to go to the toilet with a violent bowel movement. And as he rushed into the toilet and sat down, there was the most violent evacuation of his bowels ever known. And in doing so, he died a horrible death on the toilet. Nicaea was monumental, and the creed that it produced, though edited and added to in the First Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, remains to this day the most widespread and accepted standard of what it means to be a Christian, what it is that Christians believe, what unites Christians around the world. Though ultimately it failed miserably to resolve the Melitian Schism or the Arian heresy, it set out forever the pattern by which major doctrinal decisions would be resolved. It cemented the role of the emperor as governor and patron of the church, and introduced the idea of worldwide binding canons or laws around how the church is to be governed. And so to close, a few questions. Firstly, what was seen as so wrong with declaring there was a time when the sun was not? And why does it matter? Secondly, there's a difference between homoousia and homoousia. Homoousia and homoousia. Between similar nature or essence and the same nature or essence. In the Greek, it's just one letter difference, an iota of a letter I, homoi or homo. But that one letter was enough to split an entire empire. Why would the difference between similar essence and same essence, when talking about God the Son and God the Father, matter so much? What was Constantine's response to divisions like the Donatists in North Africa and the Melitians in Egypt? And what does it tell us about how authority was going to be used in the church from this point onwards?